over 25
Over
now.
25 years.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you to all of you who are here. I know that the people in New Hampshire, like the people in Iowa, and the people in South Carolina, and I know it's true of Nevada, although I have not been there yet during this process, take very seriously your role, which is a very important one. You will decide, not for another year, thank you, Alyssa, you won't be voting for anybody for another year. And during this year, you're going to be listening, I'm sure, very deeply and very carefully, because the decision you make a year from now will go far towards determining the political conversation that dominates this country for the next 2 years or so. I'm just honored to be part of the process. I'm not running against anyone. I'm running with a lot of really cool people, good people, and I know that you're just listening, and like I said, I'm grateful that you are giving me a listen. My conversation is somewhat different. I don't have a problem with any of the individuals that are running. They're all, like I said, very smart people. It's the conversation that dominates the traditional political establishment that I feel is completely inadequate for the times in which we live. It is superficial and it is narrow, and it does not speak to the causes. It speaks only to the symptoms of our national challenges. It speaks to the externals, but not to the underlying dynamics economically, socially, or emotionally, and psychologically and spiritually that have led to so many of our problems. And for that reason, that conversation would lead us to water the leaves, but not the roots of our democracy. I do not believe that there should be some class of people called people into politics, or the political establishment backed by a certain kind of media establishment, as though it's their decisions to make. This is a country that is to be we the people, and that should not just have to do with our economy or anything else. It should also have to do with who decides how we do things and what's going to happen here. So I, having had a 35-year career in a field that has to do with looking at underlying dynamics, knowing that if you really want to change your life, if you really want to transform your life, you have to do more than just tweak things on the outside. Because where we're coming from on the inside is what causes things to happen on the outside, and what's happening on the inside is what will change things to transform on the outside or not. And all that a country is a collection of people. So if that is true for us individually, it's true for us as a nation. In my career, by the time people come to me for individual counseling, it's usually because things are not going well. And things are not going well because a child is on drugs, or they just went bankrupt, or their spouse left them, or they got diagnosed with a life-challenging illness, or whatever. And what I have seen over and over again is that often it's when people are in crisis that the truth comes out. It's when they're in crisis that they get real. The crisis, they're willing to look at the things that they haven't looked at. And therefore, often the period of crisis is when the good stuff begins. Because finally somebody's getting naked and real in front of what's true. The United States of America needs to get naked and real before what's really true and what's really going on. We need some fierce and authentic truth-telling in the United States of America. If we do not have that, we will continue on the path we're on. It is increasingly perilous, and that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm running for president. We have to begin, of course, with our economy. About 40 years ago, we all know this, about 40 years ago, a particular economic worldview began to be promulgated, backed by huge financial forces, paying for the propaganda, paying for candidates, doing so much to usher into the United States not only an economic worldview, but this economic worldview has infected the sinews of our civilization. It's become like the worldview that is in a way reigning over everything. And it is a worldview which posits that market forces should be the organizing principle of our society. And the idea, of course, was that if we made short-term profit maximization for huge multinational corporate conglomerates our bottom line, and that if only they were able to make more money for their stockholders, and that of itself completely changed the social agreement in this country, because prior to that, it was considered reasonable that a corporation had more than just fiduciary or financial responsibility to its stockholders. It had ethical and moral responsibility to all stakeholders, which would include workers and environment and community. But no, we were told, just make it so that their only responsibility is to make money for the stockholders. But see, we were told this was going to be good, see, because all that money that they were going to make, it was going to trickle down. And it would trickle down, and so that rising tide was going to lift all boats. Well, after 40 years, you kind of know, the jury's in. And after 40 years, it's very clear, it has not only not lifted all boats, it has left millions of people without even a life left. It has destroyed America's middle class. It has given us the largest income inequality since 1929. It has brought us to a situation where 400 people in the United States have as much wealth as the bottom 150 million. And it has created a situation where 40% of all Americans have a difficult time making basic costs of rent and food and health care and transportation. 62% of all Americans cannot be deemed middle class. This has created immeasurable human suffering because it has created a situation where millions of people live with chronic anxiety and economic despair. How am I going to, what will happen if I get sick? Or what will happen if my kids get sick? Or how am I going to pay for my kids to go to college? Or how am I going to pay for my college loans? And nobody can soar in that kind of situation. Nobody can be who we are, and who we are, and the spirit within us, and the creativity within us, and the productivity that really wants to come out is the source not only of our individual good, it's the source of our economic good and the source of our social good. This economic system that I'm describing to you in no way has to do with long-term economic planning in this country. It has nothing to do with planning for economic vibrancy. All it does is leach the economic good in the present. You know, any company that's planning long-term economic good invests in its new products. But this is about not investing in the new products. It's about taking what you can now for a certain group of people. We have to change our entire economic paradigm. It is a 200-year-old set of givens that should not be given the credence that they are currently given. The way to increase economic vibrancy 10 years from now is to take better care of our 10-year-olds today. Now, what do you call an individual who has no morals? What do you call an individual who has no ethics? What do you call an individual that cares only about themselves? What do you call an individual that has no remorse or regret if they have hurt someone else? What do you call that person? A sociopath. So what should we call an economic system, which similarly claims that it shouldn't have to have any ethics? It shouldn't have to have any morals. It shouldn't have to have any compassion. It shouldn't have to care about what indigenous tribe got killed because of what they did, or what children are being poisoned by the water, or what children are being exposed to pesticides that we know actually do harm to a child's brain. What do you call an economic system that does not consider any moral or ethical consideration to be part of how it should do business? What do you call that? A sociopathic economic system. Now, isn't New Hampshire supposed to be live free or die? We'll get that this is tyranny, because that is a tyrannous sociopathic economic system. That is what we're talking about here. And like I said, it has not only come to dominate our economics, it has infused itself into our very worldview. And because of all the nefarious influence of money on our politics, especially since Citizens United decision, our government acts more as a handmaiden to those multinational conglomerates than it does as an advocate for the people and the planet on which we live. Be very clear. I believe we all need to be very clear. That represents a veiled aristocratic system. This country was founded to overturn aristocracy. You can have an aristocracy or you can have a democracy. You can't have both. And at a time when we have turned of the people, by the people, and for the people, into of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations, it is the most American thing in the world to push back, to say, no, we will not be doing that. That is what happened when we answered slavery with abolition. That is what happened when we have answered oppression and suppression of women with feminism and the suffragette movement. That is what happened when we answered segregation and institutionalized white supremacy with the civil rights movement. We are not the first generation to once again have to be facing this new formation of aristocracy. We are not the first generation to be facing this new iteration of un-American anti-democratic forces. Let's just not be the first generation to wimp out on doing the job it's going to take to get this country back on track. Ladies and gentlemen, the answer to a really bad way of doing things is not the better version of a really bad way. And I'd like to talk to you for a moment about the painful underbellies of American society that have been created by this, and that spell such peril to our democracy and to the human race if we do not interrupt this pattern and intervene. And it is time, make no mistake about it, for we the people of the United States to intervene. The first has to do with the fact that we have millions of American children, millions of them, who live in chronic trauma. Millions of American children who go to school every single day, in schools many of which do not meet minimum safety requirements, quite a few of which do not even have functioning toilets, and in classrooms where there are not the adequate school supplies to teach a child how to read. If a child has not learned to read by the age of 8, the chances of their high school graduation is drastically decreased, and the chances of their incarceration is drastically increased. Millions of these children live in what's called America's domestic war zones, whether the violence is in their homes, their families, their streets, or their communities. The PTSD psychologists tell us that the PTSD of returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan is no more severe than the post-traumatic stress of these children, except that it's not post-traumatic stress in the case of these children, it's present traumatic stress because it is triggered and re-triggered every day. These children do not vote, therefore they're not considered a constituency, but according to the U.S. Constitution, they are full citizens. And in our Declaration of Independence, it says that God gave all men unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it is the role of government. Governments are instituted to secure those rights, Well, what's happening today, these children, these millions of children do not vote. They're not old enough, so they're not a constituency. And they're not old enough to work. So they do not represent a financial leverage. So if you have no financial leverage in America today, and you have the system of legalized bribery that we have, which is what our government has become, how can these children possibly compete with the economic clout of these huge multinational conglomerates? Now, if an individual neglects a child, they are at best unethical and at worst criminal. We are practicing collective child neglect. That is what is happening with these children. All we are doing is normalizing their despair. Meanwhile, we are the only country in the world that bases our education funding on property taxes. So that means that a child in a poor neighborhood is going to get a less quality education, which only extends the trajectory of poverty. Our economic system was designed before we even knew all that goes on in the brain of a child underneath the age of 8. Psychologists, neurologists now talk about the neuroplasticity of the small child's brain, about the cognitive functioning and the capacity for cognitive retention. You can go to any kindergarten anywhere in this country, you want to see the genius of America? You want to see the potential for social and economic good in America? You want to see the real entrepreneurial spirit of America? Go to any kindergarten in this country. And that is why we need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of children 10 years old and younger. Be very clear. As I said before, our economic system has nothing to do with planning a vibrant economy in 10 years. And that is why, in order for us to have a vibrant economy in 10 years, we would do much more for the children today. This is the richest country in the world. And you and I, American citizens, have been trained to ask for too little. We have been trained to expect so little. When you look at all this unnecessary suffering in this country, you have to remind yourself, wait, we're the richest country in the world. Why in the richest country in the world are we taking arts out of the classrooms? Why in the richest country in the world are we normalizing the despair of millions of people? Well, it's not going to change until and unless we the people step in. And I want to tell you something about what I'm saying so far and what I'm going to say the rest of the day. Every traditional political candidate knows what I'm saying. The difference between us is I'll say it. Somebody has to say it. And somebody's going to issue that's a sort of nefarious underbelly in the United States today, about which we need to have a far more authentic and fiercely honest conversation, has to do with race. I do not believe the average American is a racist. I do not. I believe the average American is a decent person, just like everybody else in the world, but we have not been leading with our decency. We have not been leading enough with our goodness. I think the average American, while not a racist, I do believe the average American is undereducated and underinformed about the history of race in the United States, particularly since the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, federal troops were stationed in the South for 12 years to make sure that slavery was not reinstituted. And as soon as the federal troops left, the Southern legislatures passed what were called black code laws to ensure subpar economic and social and political opportunities for the former slave population. When the war was over, former slaves were promised, a family of 4, 40 acres and a mule. Now, most of us have heard that term, but I want to go deep with this, because think about this. If you've had 2.5 centuries, that's how long slavery existed in this country. So it started in the 1600s, and then it really revved up with the cotton industry in the 1800s. But at the end of the Civil War, you're talking about, some people say 4 million, some people say as high as 5 million, but at least 4 million people, okay? Now, I think we would all agree that if I've been kicking someone to the ground, I owe it to them to do more than just stop kicking. I also owe it to them to say, here, let me help you get up. So those 40 acres and a mule were promised, in most cases not given, but even when given, in most cases, once the federal troops left, then given back to the original owners, of course, who would have been the former slave owners. With the passage of the Black Code laws, Ku Klux Klan, John Birch Society, then by the end of the 1800s, you've got the full-on spate of lynchings, right? The hanging of black people, hanging of white people who supported them. So by 1900, you have full-on institutionalized white supremacy and segregation. So follow the timeline here. 1865, the war is over. None of what I am now describing was fundamentally addressed for 100 years, until the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. King, in the 1960s. So you've got 2.5 centuries of slavery, followed by another 100 years of violence. Now, it's not the violence of slavery, but it's still systemic violence perpetrated against the people, which is why you had what was called the Great Migration of a lot of black Americans who then fled to places like Detroit, Cleveland, etc., hoping they could find work there, and often meeting with racial prejudice that was not a lot less severe. With Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, the civil rights legislation did a lot to dismantle external aspects of segregation. The next year in 1965 was the Voting Rights Act to ensure that blacks would have full rights within voting. And we should all be aware that in 2013, our Supreme Court, led by John Roberts, started chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. And as soon as that happened, what do we have now? All these voter suppression efforts all through the country that would not have been possible before 2013 and the chipping away of the Voting Rights Act. And of course, they are aimed primarily at people of color and disenfranchised communities. So what we have done, and I don't mean or want to, and I don't think any of us would, to disparage or in any way diminish the profound sacrifices and struggles and successes of our ancestors, black and white, in terms of not only ending slavery, dismantling segregation, and extending civil rights, but we also, as adults who are prepared to have a more serious and deeper conversation, need to, I believe, understand the ways in which we're actually sliding backwards. Mass incarceration means we're sliding backwards. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing means we're sliding backwards. Voter suppression efforts mean we're sliding backwards. Race and reconciliation with this part of our history is multidimensional. There are many aspects to it. National atonement, as Abraham Lincoln said. But I also believe not only must we atone if we're really going to heal, if we're going to have a moral healing, a spiritual healing, a deep healing that does not just address the externals, we must atone, but we must also make amends. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since World War II. They can't make the Holocaust not have happened, but those reparations have gone far toward reconciling Germany with the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. In 1988, Ronald Reagan passed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. There were over 100,000 people who were interned in the Japanese internment camps during World War II. And in 1988, every surviving prisoner was given between $20,000 and $22,000. I believe it is time for us to have a program and to pay reparations for slavery. There's no way you can put a dollar amount on evil. But at the same time, you can work. There are many people, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Sandy Darity, and others, who have been doing work on this subject. The number, while we could never come up with a number that would actually include 2.5 centuries of unpaid labor by millions and millions of people. However, we can have a board of trustees, a council of African American elders, who would decide as they, whether it is 100 billion or whether it is, some say 500 billion, some say 100 billion. I think anywhere less than 100 billion is an insult. And that you could give this money over 10 years to be dispersed as they see fit to economic and educational renewal projects, which then give the black community an opportunity to close the statistical gap between economic prosperity among blacks and everyone else. That gap is a legacy of slavery. Now, I know that if you're a brilliant Oprah Winfrey or Tyler Perry or Magic Johnson or something, we have achieved a situation, and this is very much to be celebrated, that if you're enough of a genius in America, you can make it no matter who you are. That of itself is not social justice. America should be about the fact that you shouldn't have to be a genius. You should just have to be an American, and you're working hard and you're trying to make it, and you should have the same opportunity as anyone else. The third thing I'd like to discuss with you is our national defense agenda. The problem, as we know, is that short-term profit maximization for huge multinational corporations is the bottom line, rather than advocacy for our people and our planet. This is why short-term profits of oil companies and chemical companies are placed before climate change. This is why they've gutted the Clean Water Act, they've gutted the Clean Air Act. They have overturned the ban on pesticides that are absolutely known to harm a developing child's brain. But what do you expect when you have your environmental protection agency led by a former chemical executive? Before him, it was a former oil company executive. The first Secretary of State in this administration was an ex-CEO of Exxon, and the guy who now runs the Defense Department is an ex-30-year executive from Boeing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not even a covert corporate takeover, it's an overt corporate takeover. There's nothing, it's totally brazen. And that's why I feel as someone, I'm 66 years old, I feel anybody over 50, part of our job is to tell the young ones, it didn't used to be this way. It did not used to be this way. We used to have a healthy capacity to guffaw at craziness like that. And because we did, they knew they couldn't get away with it. But now we have one major political establishment that says, yo, what of it? And we have another major political establishment that says, I know it's really terrible. And it's really upsetting. And so what we have is like abused children. We have the father abusing the child and the mother standing in the hall saying, well, when you get done with your abuse, I'll give you tea. About this, and I'm going to do everything I can to help you with the peripheral pain, but I too will not address the underlying forces making all that pain inevitable, because I need the corporate dollars too. Americans need to wake up now. I know many people, unfortunately, and I know this is true in New Hampshire, it's true everywhere, unfortunately, these days, we become very sophisticated in our understanding about drugs. And one of the things that we know is from so many experiences that so many have had is that if you abuse your body a certain way, survival of the body is not guaranteed. It is time for the American people to awaken from our magical thinking. The survival of our democracy is not guaranteed either. And the survival of life on Earth is not guaranteed either. Any species which displays behavior that is maladaptive for its survival either evolves or it goes extinct. And we are now displaying behavior that is not well adaptive for our survival. We will either change, or it is reasonable to assume that we too will go extinct. And what the perils and the challenges that are posed to us by climate change are such that if we do not recognize the urgency and the emergency of climate change in the next 12 years, we need chemical company and oil company people to get jobs elsewhere, not at the EPA. We need the Environmental Protection Agency to be led by a world-class environmentalist. We need every world-class environmentalist to want to work there, and we need a president who recognizes the urgency of the problem and gives all executive power, as well as the power to build consensus among the American people. We need a president who convinces the American people and stands strong within it. The debate is over. Having said that, I do want to say this one thing. When it comes to climate change, just make sure it's a Democrat. Because I think, as long as it's a Democrat, I think climate change will be addressed. Some of these other issues, we've got to do more than just elect a Democrat. On climate change, we just got to make sure that it's a Democrat. The next one, just as perilous as anything else we're talking about here, is our national security agenda. Like everything else, our environmental agency is more about the oil company and chemical company executives. Our agricultural policies are too much about not executives, profits. Our agricultural policies are too much about agribusiness profits. And when it comes to national defense, this is every bit as dangerous as climate change and anything else. So this is the deal. We have had since World War II, understandably, I don't think any of us would argue that this is not necessary. We have a standing army. We didn't have standing armed forces before World War II. I have great respect for our military. I think we all do. My critique here is not a critique of the military. My critique is a critique of the way the military is being led by civilian forces. And of course, we need civilian forces to be doing that. But the irresponsibility of the system is such that when it comes to our defense policies, as with everything else, it has more to do with short-term profit maximization for military industrial contractors than it does with waging peace. Donald Rumsfeld, George Bush's Secretary of Defense, said we must do more than prepare for war, we must wage peace. General Mattis, before he left the Department of Defense, said, if you are not going to fully fund the State Department, I'm going to need to buy more ammunition. Now, since he left, by the way, it's worth noting that the man who now heads the Defense Department was a 30-year executive at Boeing. So what happens now is we'll have a $718 billion budget, even just this year, on our defense, but we keep decreasing, or certainly the efforts are there to decrease State Department. State Department is about diplomacy, theoretically, and humanitarian efforts that have to do with waging peace. How do you wage peace? You expand economic opportunities for women. You expand educational opportunities for children, and to whatever extent possible, you ameliorate unnecessary human suffering. Where women have more economic opportunity, children have more educational opportunity, and if suffering is decreased, violence goes down. But where is the corporate profits to be made from that? So that's not where we put our resources. We put more on preparing. That's like saying I'll spend all my money on medicine, but I won't do anything to cultivate health. And we now know sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. War is the absence of peace. Peace isn't the absence of war. So just like our current economic system has nothing to do with planning for a great economy 25 years from now, our defense strategy has nothing to do actually with planning for peace. There should be a far more robust relationship between the Defense Department and the State Department. Right now, what we do, we have a $100 billion arms sale to the Saudi Arabians, okay? $100 billion, plus we have that $500 million, which is Boeing's contract. Now let's be really clear. People used to say, well, we're selling all these arms to Saudis, but it really doesn't matter because they're not doing anything with it. Well, with this new prince, he's decided to do something with it. And it's a war in Yemen, where tens of thousands of people, primarily children, have starved. That war could not be prosecuted without our military support. So what does our Secretary of State say? He says, well, you can have strategic partnerships with people who do not share your values. No, you can't. That means you have no values. That means you have sacrificed your values. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what is happening in this country. It is a spiritual and moral dysfunction that leads us to place oil company and chemical company profits before the health and well-being of our own children. It is a spiritual malfunction that allows us to put their profits before taking care of climate change. No species destroys its own habitat and survives. It is a spiritual and moral dysfunction that leads us to put profit-making for Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and all the rest of them before planning for peace on Earth. And we have to address that level. And when we address that level, we address our own responsibility. Not only our own responsibility for how things got here, but also our own responsibility for what it's going to take to change them. How it got here, all of these things we're talking about today are like opportunistic infections. They could never have gotten this bad had there not been a weakening of our societal immune system. Each and every one of us are cells in the immune system of our society, and a large part of what has happened has been because of our chronic disengagement from the political process. And I think many people realize that now, and perhaps it took us getting this close to the cliff to realize it. This is not something where you can send somebody to Washington and they're going to fix it. The president does not have a magic wand, thank God. This is going to have to be an uprising in the consciousness of each and every one of us. We're going to have to change in order to interrupt this pattern. Because even interrupting this pattern, it is not going to mean that we are acquiescent. Just as a political system, our political system should not be acquiescent to this authoritarian corporatism. We should not be acquiescent to a political establishment that doesn't mention the bad part. Not really. That only talks about the externalities, because that is not fierce, it is not authentic, it is not the level of conversation that we need to have in order to transform this country. There are perils, very real perils in our midst, but very real possibilities. America was born out of the audacity to say, no, we won't be doing that. That was
was the founding of this country. To King George, no, we will not be doing that. To an aristocracy, no, we will not be doing that. To slavery, no, we will not be doing that. To segregation, no, we will not be doing that. To suppression of women, no, we will not be doing that. And now it is time for us to say to authoritarian corporatism and either side of a political establishment that has so much moral equivocation, even if it says, well, we're just going along a little. You didn't just go along a little with slavery. You didn't just go along a little with segregation. And you didn't just take incremental approaches to dealing with those things. You say in a really high-spirited American way, no, we will not be doing that. Book by a woman named Sue Monk Kidd. Maybe they have it here at this bookstore. A wonderful book. She's the one who wrote Secret Life of Bees, but her other books are great too. And she wrote a book called The Invention of Wings. And The Invention of Wings is a book about two historical figures named the Grimke sisters. Has anybody read that book? Great, isn't it? So the Grimke sisters were born into a slave-owning family in Charleston, South Carolina. But they became two leading abolitionists and two leading feminists, having been converted by the Quakers. And there was so much there that was so revelatory about the book. There were a lot of people who were raised in slave-owning families, the whole Amazing Grace phenomenon, and what they went through. But what the book brought to my attention that I had never thought about before is what would have been the difference between being anti-slavery and actually being an abolitionist. So if you were anti-slavery, you said, I don't agree with slavery, I think it's insane, I think it's evil, I would never own another human being, I don't even want to live in a slave-owning state, I don't want anything to do with anything. Noble, but that of itself would not have moved the needle for even one slave. But there's a bridge that people crossed from anti-slavery to abolition. And that was an emotional bridge, a psychological bridge, a bridge having to do with courage, a bridge having to do with moral conviction. And that was a bridge from I don't agree with it to not on my watch. I don't agree with it will maybe defeat Donald Trump. It is naive to think that it's as simple as that. There are so many people lined up behind him. If all we do is defeat him, we got to be tough enough to defeat him. Oh, please. That's a naive conversation posing as sophisticated. Because if all you do is that, then it's not addressing the deeper dynamic that gives rise to that kind of phenomenon. We have to go deeper than that and realize that the only thing that will ultimately drown out dog whistles is if we drown them out with angel voices. And when Lincoln talked about the angels of our better nature, that was not a metaphor. Just like racism and bigotry and anti-Semitism and homophobia and Islamophobia are the demons of our inner nature. Love for each other, love for our children, love for the earth, love for democracy, those are the angels of our better nature. More people love in this country than hate. The problem is, people who hate in this country hate with conviction. And people who hate have done the work it takes to form political force. Now, those of us who love need to love with conviction. Those of us who care about dignity. Those of us who care about dignity and democracy and our great-great-grandchildren need to now love with conviction and with political force. This is not just time for random acts of kindness. This is time for some huge strategized acts of doing the right thing. Yes. We have lost our moral core. And now I hear apparently morality and love do well in focus groups. So that's clear. But you know, the words don't land like they do with people who have been using those words for 35 and 40 years. We need a moral and a spiritual awakening in this country. And if I may say so, I think someone who's been a moral and spiritual awakener for 35 years kind of has some qualifications that would help make that happen. Rise up as other generations have risen up. The generation that brought us abolition, and the generations that brought us the civil rights movement, the generations that brought us a suffragette movement. You know, a lot of people in the world
are rolling their eyes about America today. And this is not good. This is not good for the world that America has lost our moral leadership the way we have. People are rolling their eyes and thinking, God, we're asleep. When are we going to wake up? And there have been certainly times in history when we've been slow to get it. But anybody who knows world history knows. Sometimes we are slow to wake up, but when we do wake up, we slam it like nobody's business. And we're going to slam it this time. It took us a while, but we're awake now. There's nothing like dishonor to make us think, no, honor matters. There's nothing like seeing indignity and indecency in the public sphere to make us know that dignity and decency do matter. And I feel very, very strongly, we are good people, and we know what to do. We need to pray in our own way really hard right now. We need to love each other as we have never loved each other before, and we need to kick ass. Thank you. Be glad to talk about anything anybody wants to talk about, ask whatever you'd like to ask, or mention. Yes, ma'am, in the back there.
What about the pharmaceutical industry with government?
Big pharma is right up there with oil, chemical, agribusiness, health insurance companies, military. Big pharma is right up there. Right up there. Yes, sir.
I have a question that's something to speak to. I feel like empathy and compassion. And I wanted to find out, where do you think in our narrative was there like a really disconnect of people having empathy and compassion in our world? Because if there was a lot more of that, I feel like some of these things wouldn't be happening.
That is why I talked about a sociopathic economic system and what happened 40 years ago. It wasn't, once we acquiesced, because remember this sociopathic economic system, the core of which is that there is no empathy or compassion. If you say all that matters is my fiduciary responsibility to my stockholders, let's look at this in practical terms. So every scientist in the Obama administration that was part of the Environmental Protection Agency said that there is a certain pesticide which we know does harm to a developing child's brain. They voted, every one of them, that this pesticide be permanently banned. Soon after this administration came into power, there was a secret hotel meeting between Scott Pruitt, the former head of the EPA, a oil company lobbyist or executive from the past, a secret meeting in Houston, where I was born and raised, with the chemical company that makes that pesticide, and the ban was overturned. Where's the empathy? Where's the, oh my God, this could damage a child's brain. But what was important? What was important? The money, the profits for the chemical company. So this is what I meant when I said earlier that it has infected the sinews of our civilization. It's not just our economy that has become so transactional. Our relationships to each other has become transactional. What can I get? What do I want to make happen? These days you think Jesus had said love yourself rather than love each other. It's not about love myself, I don't know where we got this. I'm sure Louise Hay, wherever she is, realizes now it was a mistake. It's not just about, it can't just be about me. Especially disguised as some higher spiritual principle. It's about loving each other. And so, listen, not everything is going to be fixed on the level of governmental action. It's in the government and it's in us. I mean, it's in all of us have to look and have a certain worldview of self-reference rather than fellowship and love has taken, has just come to, it's like this river of toxicity. So it's in our marriages, it's in our intimate relationships, it's in our community relationships, and it's in our government. But in some of the work, it's like we need an integrative whole person politics, just like an integrative whole person medicine. There are many elements that make up the cultivation of health. But I think a lot of the people, what I see in America is people are good, people are decent, people ask themselves, what does it mean to have integrity? What does it mean to have ethics? What does it mean to have right relationship? But what we have done is kept too much of that conversation in the private realm. And we've left the public realm to people who are into that kind of thing, for political people, hoping somebody's taking care of it, and that's the mistake. In a democracy, we're all political people. There's not supposed to be a political class that somehow gets to drive the car. That's not the way a democracy is supposed to happen. So I think you're right, sir, that is the ultimate problem, but that is in us, and it is also a question we should be asking ourselves in terms of political policy as well. Where is the ethics in gutting the Clean Water Act? Where is the empathy in gutting the Clean Air Act? Especially since once you gut the Clean Water Act, the people who are going to mainly suffer from that will be people in the more disadvantaged communities like Flint, Michigan. That is an issue of empathy. It is an issue of compassion. And too many of us have gone, well, but that's a political issue.